Hey everybody, we've made it. It is release day for Zoey Punches the Future and the Dick. I'm here at the release party at my New York penthouse with all of the greats of contemporary literature are here. I don't even need to say their names. You've read as much great modern literature as I have. You know who I'm talking about. I think I saw Tom Wolfe walk by and his wife, Virginia. All of the Wolfe writers are here, the Wolf Pack, they call themselves. But I'm going to take a break from all that to answer your fan questions that I had you ask like 6 months ago and then forgot about. I'm going to go through these quickly because I know your time is valuable, and I of course want to get back to the festivities. I think they're all going to play cornhole later. Right off the bat, multiple people ask, as usual, about the status of the TV series. Still have not heard anything. That's not unusual. This is kind of the process. It's still just in development, which means somebody may be working on it somewhere for a platform that I'm not going to name because I don't know that I'm free to do that. No guarantee that it will become a show. No guarantee that it won't. If it doesn't, then at some point the rights simply revert back to me and I can sell them to someone else. But hopefully it successfully gets made and I'll get an email tomorrow saying, hey, they're shooting the show. Are they shooting stuff now with the pandemic? Is stuff back in production? Either way, I just assumed that even if they were in the process of doing something, that it probably got derailed by COVID along with everything else in Hollywood. But otherwise, we're just in a holding pattern, and that's fine. Nicholas and Charlie both asked questions that basically boil down to, why don't you write way more than you do now? Nicholas asked, would you consider writing a third series or maybe create a website where you publish, short stories? Charlie asked, do you ever write short stories? Would you consider doing a collection? It's just a matter of time. Right now, I'm barely meeting the obligations I'm under contract for, which is just writing the next John and Dave book, due at the end of next year, and then publicizing this book, which is a full-time job through this release window because I am a full-time author now. And so obviously, if these books don't sell, then I will not be a full-time author anymore. But with every creative person, you have a certain number of ideas that occur to you. So there's a threshold where if you try to write too much, then the writing starts to become bad, or you're just repeating the same thing over and over again, the same jokes and themes and all that. And I don't want to do that. I want to die knowing that everything I wrote was pretty good, if at all possible. So no, right now that's the whole issue. Maybe things will change in the future, but the whole thing right now is, for example, writing a third series or some book that's not one of the two ongoing series I have, which is of course the John and Dave books and the Zoey books. The new one that just came out today is called Zoey Punches the Future and the Dick. Any third thing that I wrote would come instead of one of those. It means I would have to put off one of those, would have to take a 2-year gap where it wasn't being written, and so you would go 5 or 6 or 7 years in between episodes. And maybe that would be okay, and there's no guarantee with the next book deal that I wouldn't do exactly that. But in terms of like side projects, things like writing short stories and stuff just for fun, it's just so hard because I'm under contract to do this other thing. So anything that I did on the side that's sort of just for my own amusement, it would feel like I'm I really should be doing the work that I've already been paid for. But there's maybe that'll change. Maybe I'll have more energy in the future. You know how when people get older, sometimes they get more energy. Sam says, I'm curious about your thoughts on the future of writing, books, articles, websites, all of it as a profession. I've seen you share some fairly bleak stuff regarding sites shutting down with all the layoffs. Is that field going to pivot or just slowly shrink forever? Longtime fans know that I was at crack.com, which had become this huge operation that then laid everybody off in late 2017 as part of an industry-wide collapse. And then I left Crack just in this spring to write books full time. And of course, I've got many, many friends who want to write books and then find that it's very difficult to get into that, whether they're self-publishing or trying to go through a publisher. It's just the market is more difficult now. The thing is, though, it is hard to talk about how it's harder to make a living off these things without acknowledging that the reason it's harder to make a living is that it's so much easier to just write and get your stuff out there. And I can't act like I'm mad about that because that's how I got here. You know, John Dies at the End, the book that bought this house or this my Manhattan loft where this release party is being held, this cocktail party, that was just originally just published online for free. I just wrote it, you know, I had a blog and I was just updating it one chapter at a time and giving it away. And then it kind of grew, you know, a following, and there was some buzz, and then I sold the film rights to it and then eventually got a book deal. So I can't get mad at the fact that writing has kind of been devalued by all of the, you know, the marketplace has been flooded with people doing it, you know, with hobbyists doing it for free, either uploading their books to, you know, the Amazon, the Kindle marketplace, or just posting them to the internet, places like Wattpad, things like that, and either giving them away for free or charging 99 cents for them. And so the volume of stuff being written is many, many, many times higher than it's ever been at any point in human history. Whether you're talking about books or, and again, the stuff that they're uploading, it's not all like Pregnant Sonic the Hedgehog slash fiction. It's you know, it's actually good science fiction, things like that. But whether you're talking about books or whether you're talking about any kind of commentary, you know, movie reviews or sports writing, you know, once upon a time, those were like cherished positions that you had to work at some crappy newspaper for years to get like a sports column to spot. And now anybody can do it. Well, as a sports fan, it's fantastic. There's an ocean of great writing about, you know, about sports or about any possible niche subject you can imagine. But the downside is if you dreamed of making like a full-time income doing that, it's rough. Because any operation you're running, ultimately the reason why it's so hard to make money, because ad rates have gotten so low, because it's so hard to get subscribers, is because there's so many alternatives out there. It's hard to charge people money to come read your blog when there's a million blogs about the same subject that are free. So in some ways, it may be harder now to make a good full-time living off of writing than maybe it's been in the past. But it's also much, much easier to just get your writing out there. If your goal is just to express yourself and to gather an audience and to share your thoughts with the world, it's easier than ever. So in some ways, the situation that me and all of my fellow writers and editors, a lot of them are now out of work, are in, is kind of the same situation you'd be in if you worked as a farmer or in the food industry or as a chef in an era when somebody invented like that Star Trek replicator machine that just makes the food out of thin air. Like that would be a miracle for humanity because suddenly there's free food for everybody all the time. But if your job was to grow the food and cook the food prior to that, now you're screwed because nobody needs your your services, or else your services have become this niche thing that only, that there has to be something like extra special about the way you do it in order to actually get paid for it, because otherwise your skill has less value, because just due to supply and demand. Now, that said, there's plenty of my peers and coworkers who have absolutely been screwed over by their jobs and who absolutely have been mistreated, working for websites, whether it's what they, in what they got paid, or how they lost their jobs, or in severance pay they didn't get, that sort of thing. There's plenty there to criticize. There's also plenty of capitalist vultures who have ruined websites and publications. I'm not letting them off the hook. I'm just saying that when I talk about the marketplace as being bleak, the benefit for humanity is probably good in the long run, because all of these barriers between creator and audience have fallen away. Anyone with a computer and internet access can sit down and start typing up a book right now. Whereas, when I was born, there were so many hurdles you had to go through, and only a select few people would ever get their manuscript read by an editor, or they would only a select few people would ever get an agent. And then, you basically, unless you had a giant company willing to print up paper copies of your book and stock it on shelves, then your thing was simply never going to be seen. And now that's over. So if you're an aspiring writer, my advice would be, if you're in it for the love of writing and for the love of connecting with an audience and telling a story, you're in for it. You were born at the best possible time. But if your goal is to make a living where you're actually able to pay a mortgage, buy health insurance, everything else with writing, it's much harder than it was probably 20 years ago or so. Jordan asks, was it more difficult writing a female protagonist for futuristic violence in fancy suits? Of course, this book series has the protagonist is Zoey Ash. And how was the writing process similar or dissimilar from a male protagonist? Which did you enjoy writing more? A lot of people ask this question, but if you're a writer, the very first thing you're going to have to do is write characters who are not like yourself, they have a different worldview or a different attitude or just different personality type. The worst books you've read are ones where the writer only knows how to write in their own voice, where every character has the same sense of humor, every character talks the same. So the first thing you have to learn how to do is to put yourself into someone else's head and say, okay, well, I'm a very shy, introverted person, but this character is not. Or I'm not a religious person, but this character is very religious. And so the first thing you have to do to successfully write any fiction at all is have the ability to kind of understand people, understand why people are the way they are, understand different personality types and where they're coming from, and then have the ability to write them from an empathetic point of view. Because if you hate everyone who isn't like yourself, when you try to write that person, it's going to come off as very inauthentic. Like if you're not a religious person and the only thing you can think about, like Christians, is that they're just bitter, hateful people, you're not going to be able to write a Christian character, because no real person walks around thinking of themselves as like a miserable, closed-minded jerk. Everyone thinks they're doing their best. So you have to be able to kind of get inside this character, even if it's your antagonist, your bad guy. You've got to be able to write them as a real person, and real people love themselves. Real people feel justified in acting the way they act. So you have to be able to say, okay, if I was this person, if I was from this background, how would that inform the way I act, the way I am? And so it doesn't matter whether you're writing a woman, whether you're writing someone who is, a crime victim, whether you're writing, somebody who's out for revenge. You're having to sit there and say, okay, how would their life experiences inform who they are? And it's not necessarily different for writing a woman in the sense that my worldview and my attitude is a lot closer to Zoe's than it is to some of the bad guys in the book who are all men, like Molech, the villain of the first book. I don't think like him. I think more like Zoe. But that said, lots of men struggle to write women. Lots of women struggle to write men. This is. I would not pretend that I'm at the world's best at it. I'm just saying that the best you can do is try to write those characters with empathy and try to understand where they're coming from. Manda asks, I was wondering how, when writing books that are so different, but writing them so close together, how do you avoid the same feel or flow from seeping into the other book? Is there a long span from book to book? I'm glad you asked, because that is by far the hardest part of my job. I intentionally have a second series that I wrote. The John and Dave books, the non-Zoe books, are, it's very gruesome horror comedies. The Zoe books are science fiction. They are a little bit more grounded. The plotting is a little bit tighter and makes more sense, I guess you could say. They're very different by design because I didn't want to be doing the same thing all the time, but there's no gap in between them at all. The day I stop writing one, I start writing the next, and while I'm editing one, I'm writing the other one. Right now, I'm promoting Zoe while I'm about 50 to 60% through writing the next John and Dave book. And obviously, to promote Zoe, I have to be able to talk about it and put myself into the mindset and remember what those books are about. Because all of this exists in your brain and you've got the voices of all these characters in there, and you're trying to keep it separate and you're trying to make sure they have a different feel, they have a different rhythm, it is extremely difficult. I do not doubt that I have completely failed at times to separate the two, where there are periods where the Zoe books very much come off, their stretches or conversations that sound like something out of a John and Dave book, and vice versa. I am not perfect. Trying to build a strict wall in between the two, and just like, I'm fortunate if I'm managed to just avoid using the same line or the same joke from book to book. I don't doubt I've accidentally done that and the editors caught it, or maybe they didn't. Maybe you're going to reply, actually the exact same sentence is turned up in 3 different books. How did you not know that? Zanzibar Buck McFate, hope that's your real name, asks, how much of the final book do you typically have in mind when you start writing? How often do characters or scenes take a life of their own and end up dramatically different from what you had in mind? Every author will have a different answer to this, and there's no right way to do it. I know that George R.R. Martin famously does not outline, I don't think, anything in his books except for in the most loosest of terms, because he feels like it's a more organic process to kind of just set out and let the characters take you to where they're going to go. But also, I think that's why he never finished that series, or at least it appears he's never going to finish it, because the characters did not naturally lead themselves back to a conclusion of the story, so they kind of just all went off their own directions. I heavily plan an outline in advance. The first months of the process is spent diagramming. I have a big whiteboard on my wall that's just out of view that I chart stuff out. For me, I struggle to write the beginning of a book unless I know where it's going, because I'm writing with that ending in mind and I'm setting up, dominoes that I'm going to knock down later. But of course, you adjust it as you go. You find out, as you write it, there's things you thought were going to work that don't, or that, you think of something better. You have a better idea than what you had when you did the outline. So you're always adjusting, but I am always adjusting an outline. I'm never just typing like let's see where the story takes me. My brain just doesn't work that way. But that said, I would even say that most other authors say that outlining makes the book worse. I think Stephen King says that he generally knows where it's going to end up, but that when he sits down to try to plan it out, in advance, that it comes off as too mechanical or predictable or whatever. For me, it's the opposite. I can, if I'm planning out everything, I can look at it and make sure that if there's a twist, and with the John and Dave books, there's a new twist like every 8 pages or something like that. Making sure that it actually makes sense, that the twist is something where if you read the book a second time, it's like, oh, that was actually there all along. Well, for me, that's only possible if I plan it all in advance versus just like, oh, it'd be cool if something completely out of left field happened right here, and then try to, explain it after the fact. I will circle back. If I decide there's going to be a twist, I'll circle back and set it up. But it's all pretty organized. The last John and Dave book, called What the Hell Did I Just Read? It has that title because there are things at the very end that kind of put the entire book up to that point in a different light. In theory, if you read the book a second time, it should read as a completely different book. That was the result of a nightmarish amount of planning to get it there. Derek from Pittsburgh asked a similar question. Did you plot out a trajectory for the Zoey series in a different manner from the John and Dave stories? No, the process is pretty much the same. Now, the first John and Dave book, the one that I was publishing a bit at a time on the internet, was different. But everyone since then, I've pretty much got a process down because I have to. It would never get done if I didn't really know step by step what I was doing. Now, the structures of those plots are extremely different, and the tone and the nature of the stories, but the process is not different. I'm writing a John and Dave book with a certain amount of insanity in mind. I am planning the exact point where the story is going to go off the rails. It is a controlled crash. Dead Invisibles asks, was Zoey inspired by a person in your life? A lot of people ask this question. You really can't do this. You'll get sued. You can't take a real person and just put them in your book. It doesn't work like that. It's always elements of different people or elements of yourself. It's like the physical appearance of somebody may be just somebody you saw on a bus one day, or you passed on the sidewalk, that you just found their appearance striking. But you would never, or at least I would never, just grab a person from real life and just put them in the story, because man, that would be weird. You're writing like sex scenes and stuff with them. And so I'm imagining, like, my neighbor, they're seeing themselves in the book, and it's like, oh, you got me as, in an orgy here. That's what made you think I'm like that? And you'll be hearing from my attorney, because that's libelous. Also, same question asker asks, do you choose the audiobook readers for your books? It's a limited thing. They will, like with Zoey, the first Zoey book, I think they sent me 3 possibilities and let me vote on my favorite. But a lot of that stuff comes down to availability. Book readers, they tend to have themselves scheduled months in advance, I think. Speaking of which, you probably have noticed that I think probably even now there's no audiobook listed for Zoey Punches the Future in the Dick. It's coming. It's in production. It got delayed for reasons that really just come down to 2020. Everything is a nightmare, and we're fortunate that the book exists at all, and that we're all still alive. It'll be here. It's been a crazy year, and then hopefully the next time for the next John and Dave book, hopefully, normally you've got the audiobook ready for pre-order alongside everything else, but That was not the case this time for a bunch of complicated reasons. Joe Thunder asked, do John Dies at the End of the Futuristic Violence and Fancy Suits series all exist in the same universe? Robert similarly asked, would we ever see a John Dies at the End and Zoey crossover event? The answer to both is no. No, you cannot mix universes that have different rules, or at least I can't. Zoey's books do not take place in a universe in which the supernatural occurs. John and Dave are in a universe where they fight monsters and demons and things like that. Zoey is grounded in our world. There are no Lovecraftian horrors in Zoey's world. It's really important from a writing point of view because the rules have to be established. And so like in the John and Dave universe, in theory, someone could die and then come back to life, or someone could die and turn out to be, a clone or something. Where in the Zoey series, you have to know if somebody dies, they're dead. Now, someone out there is going to correctly point out that in the Marvel movies universe, you started out with Iron Man, who did not exist in a universe with any kind of supernatural beings or magic, and then immediately was in the Avengers movies alongside actual wizards and actual gods of myth. I realized that I actually hated that about that series because I think you have to be consistent about what type of universe you're in. But what do I know? Those movies have made probably twice as much money as my books have. A couple of people asked some very good writing process questions. Eric and Casey both basically asked, what's the process for creating a character? Eric asked, what is your process for creating an interesting character? And then Casey asked, well, like what goes into good characterization? The characters in your books are three-dimensional, distinct and relatable, as opposed to being, archetypes. So how do you do this? I kind of touched on this before, and again, any question like this that starts with like a big long compliment, I'm not automatically accepting yes, I am very good at that. But the best advice I can have is that if you're going to write at all, as I mentioned earlier, it has to start from understanding people. I think if you don't understand people, you probably cannot write convincing fiction. That's partly because, if you don't understand people, you're not going to be able to write convincing characters. But also, if you don't understand people, then you also don't really understand what your audience wants and what they're there for and what needs are they're having filled by reading your writing. That's the thing, is when you're writing, you're not just typing words into a screen. You're thinking in terms of, I am relaying these ideas to, other human beings. And you're thinking in terms of what impact this will have on them, what emotion you want them to be feeling at this moment. So both that and creating characters comes down to understanding something about human nature and psychology and people and just observing people. In my case, I don't know, maybe other authors are not like this. I didn't have a ton of friends growing up, but I was always sort of on the outside of every a clique or friend group or whatever. So I kind of became an observer of people because I was just watching what they do from the outside. Like instead of being one of the people who are obsessing over sports or what brand of shoes they wore or whatever, I was watching them and trying to understand why they were doing that because I just couldn't relate. So my efforts to try to understand why I couldn't make friends caused me to kind of approach humans in like a very academic way, where I was kind of like, well, why are all these girls in competition with each other over what brand of clothes they're wearing? Or why are they so conscientious about, when a new trend starts, that they all follow it and they all prove that and trying to understand why people are the way they are, because I didn't naturally fit in that led me to a place where by the time I was an adult, I could usually articulate, well, this type of person is insecure because of this. But also, when you're creating a character in your book, as you alluded to, or one of you alluded to, you can't stop at the archetype, like, oh, this is the nerd, or oh, this is the country bumpkin, because every person in your life who you've thought of as an archetype, if you have one single conversation with them where you actually ask them to tell you about their interest or what their hopes and their fears are, or whatever, you're going to find out they've got way more depth than that. A lot of people who seem to conform to a stereotype or something, they are doing what they're dressing and talking and acting the way their friends do, the way their friend group does, in a way that fits in with. Sorry, I got a text message from one of my famous author friends. But underneath those surface things, those signifiers of what group they're in, you'll find they've absolutely got their own individual hopes and fears and anxieties and aspirations and everything else. And so when you're creating a new character, there's two things. There's one, you want to make sure that you have the full picture of what makes that person who they are beyond just the surface things, but also you got to think about what kind of story you're trying to tell. The characters are chosen for the story they're in. Everything about Dave's personality in the John and Dave books, and Dave's personality, and Amy's and John's, their personalities are specifically geared because of the type of situations they're running into. Because you've seen three different people who deal with the unknown and deal with danger in very different ways. And their approaches are very different. And so that's all chosen by design. So in addition to trying to come up with a well-rounded character, you're trying to come up with a well-rounded character who will interact with this world in interesting ways. That's why in the Zoey books, it's why Zoey had to be a woman. It's why Zoey had to be a woman from a rural area, kind of low income, because everything she was going to encounter in this male-dominated, like high-class crime world is completely the opposite of what she is. And so it creates, dramatic tension in comedy and everything else because of this clash between what she is and this world she's encountering. Well, all of that was chosen. She wasn't chosen at random. She was chosen because of the way she fits into this world, or more specifically, how she doesn't fit into it. Kevin Bo Bevan, also hope that's his real name, says, when planning out a story, what's your method of piecing together the events? How many notes do you scribble up before you start on a project? Like you get out subjects and plot scenes to cover and then focus on how those play out. So, for example, on the John and Dave books, because those are so heavily based on the comedy, and so much of what you take home from them are individual lines and comedy bits and things like that, a lot of my notes are just lines and phrases and funny situations that I think that I will find a place for later. The notes are usually not written down. I've got a notes app on my phone where I record stuff, and then I've just got a Word doc on my computer where every time I think of a line, think of something funny that John could say or whatever, I just write it down. Some of these I've been on there 5 years ago. And I think every writer who's ever written books has done that, has had either a notepad with them or something, because ideas will pop into your head anywhere. You'll see something funny at the grocery store, or at the gym, or when you're on your jet ski, or at your fancy cocktail party with other authors. And stuff will pop into your head and you want to save that. And so what I've got, then when it comes time to doing the plot, it kind of depends on what type of story you're writing. If you're writing a murder mystery, you're probably going to start with the crime. If you're writing a romance, you're thinking, well, how do these people meet, or whatever. In my case, the John and Dave series, those are horror novels. So I'm in many cases starting with the monster. because the monster, how the monster attacks people, the thing that's dangerous about the monster, that's going to inform everything about how the story goes, how it plays out. Everything's going to revolve around that. So I've got to know what the monster is first. With the Zoey series, I'm thinking more in terms of what is the antagonist that she's taking on. What's the obstacle? What do the bad guys look like? And then think, well, what are they trying to do? What is she trying to do in response? But I think it kind of comes down to what kind of book you want to write. But I would also really emphasize, and I said this in the last video, this will be repetition for those of you who for some reason watch all of these. A book can start from anywhere. Like if these are both existing series, so I already know who the characters are and what the tone's going to be. If you're trying to write something new, it can start from any place. You know, some people start with the ending. Some people have a specific scene that they want to write and they build a book around that scene. Some people have, you know, just a character, a voice of a narrator, just a tone. The John and Dave books just started with the tone, just this idea. These are horror novels that are very graphic, but it's very, like every line's got a joke in it or every other line. So it'd be very rapid fire comedy. I didn't know what they were going to be about until I got into it. You know, a lot of books just start with a theme. You know, a lot of authors will say, well, I want to write a book about, you know, racial inequality, or I want to write a book about the decline of rural America in the Trump era. And then from there, you think, okay, well, what's the perfect set of characters and circumstances to get us into that? So it's like, well, okay, maybe it's a guy who has lost his job at a coal mine. Other times, somebody may just say there's a genre they want to write in. They may say, you know what, I want to write a Western now. And so they'll start from that and say, okay, well, if it's a Western, then who's the main character? Is it a cowboy or a rustler or a rancher? I think those are all probably the same thing. But, you know, and then so there you're just starting with a general sense of, well, we know it's going to be horses and cattle and the Old West, and you know all those elements just because you already know the genre. And then you're just trying to decide, well, what's my spin on the genre? But really, you can start from anywhere. You can also start with no idea at all. You can just start with somebody who is similar to yourself. You know, and it's like, hey, I'm in college, so I'm going to write a story about, it's just a college kid hanging out with his friends, and just kind of feel it out. See what happens. If you're struggling to get started, don't let the fact that you don't know what the book is about stop you. Just start writing, and you may discover it. Clough Pop says, what led you to cultivate and maintain an online presence that includes personal details like where you live, that sort of thing? What benefits have you seen from it? What drawbacks? Well, it's like, obviously when I started writing, the pseudonym David Wong goes back 22 years. In 1998, I first started writing on the internet. I only used a pseudonym because I wanted the freedom to write comedy and you know, comedy that is adult comedy with, you know, like adult language, things like that, without people in my life who were not, you know, not close enough to me enough to read my stuff to draw conclusions from it, because I had a day job. So for example, I wanted to be able to write some, you know, outlandish joke about something that occurred at an office without all of my coworkers at my office saying, well, is that about me? Or is that about us? So I wrote under a pseudonym purely so that they wouldn't find the stuff by Googling my real name. And then I didn't include like my location because I didn't want weirdos showing up at my house, which has happened. As time has gone on, obviously you get big enough, people are going to find you. So I mean, very early, I had my real name out there very early on, because I was never pretending to be David Wong. It was just a pseudonym for search engine purposes. But on the message boards, on the flap of the book, I put my real name on there because I thought, well, if somebody's a fan and they draw a connection, I don't care. You know, I was still working at the day job I had at the time at the insurance office, where I was just doing data entry on insurance claims. I had a website that was being read by like 500,000 people a month. So that's a lot of people. And people, when you have fans, they get curious. So people track down what city I lived in, that sort of thing. And there's kind of nothing you can do about that. I just wasn't going to make it super easy for them. But by the time I left there and got the job at Cracked in 2007, I think everybody generally knew that for the most part, it was fine. I never got in trouble for anything I wrote. I think the atmosphere was maybe a little different back then, but a lot of my fears about, like backlash I would get in real life from people were unfounded. I don't really think it's been a problem. It was more that I just didn't want to have to constantly be explaining it. And I didn't want a thing where I would come to work every Monday and they'd be like, hey, we read this article you wrote over the weekend. And then I've got to like explain it or whatever. I just didn't want to have to deal with it because my style had a really specific audience and it was aimed at that specific audience. So the people I work with, 90% of them would not have that sense of humor or that sensibility. So to them, it would either come off as crude or vulgar or stupid or whatever. And I just didn't want to have to try to explain it or justify it. That's very draining. And I absolutely did not want a situation where I felt constrained when writing, like thinking, oh my gosh, what will my coworkers think of this joke? Or what will my coworkers think? This is comedy. It needs to be outrageous. It needs to push the envelope of people's expectations to a certain degree. The moment you're writing scared of like, oh, what will the most prudish coworker think of this? I think you're probably dead in the water. If you're writing in my genre, which is, stuff that is somewhat adult or profane or outrageous or whatever. So then, as usual, I've left to the very end the questions about like the writing industry and the publishing industry, because I know that there's only like a small segment of the readership who actually cares about, that sort of thing, the ones who are the aspiring writers. I like to talk about this stuff because this is my life and my business, but I know that the average reader who is not aspiring to write something may not care. But Chase says he's writing a book and was planning on self-publishing because that is how I got started. I asked, do I think that's a good idea and do I have any pointers for potential authors? My tips are not usually great because I came up in such a different era that, for example, when I came up writing, the self-publishing ebook industry didn't exist. You could not just publish a book on a Kindle or on an ebook reader. That wasn't a thing. Those devices weren't a thing when I started out. Websites that specialize in publishing fiction like Wattpad and all of the many other ones, they didn't exist. So they weren't specific platforms back then. In terms of how to break through now, where there's probably 10,000 books a day being, flooded into that ebook marketplace and the self-publishing marketplace, I had the advantage of a platform. I had a popular blog that had a lot of readers. It was comedy essays and articles and stuff like that, and then I was able to slip in my fiction I had an existing audience who already were fans of my work and my voice or whatever, and who are receptive to reading my story. Whereas if you're just, one name on a giant list of books that have been released that day, there's no reason for anybody to read your thing because they don't know who you are. Whereas I didn't have that problem. I had built up a platform over the course of most of a decade. And so I had, I kind of built up a fan base. So if you can do that, if you can start a YouTube channel or a podcast or something else and kind of have regular updates to kind of grow an audience that you can then show your book to, that's one way to do it. Otherwise, you've got to be really good at promotion. You've got to find ways. And any tip I give you about how to promote now is going to be out of date 6 months from now. When I came up, Facebook wasn't a thing. I had a MySpace page for a while. I had a newsletter for a while. Now Facebook is dying as a platform that people can use. If you don't have money to spend on promoted posts, it is dying. Instagram is not as good for authors to promote. Twitter, but it changes all the time. You're seeing a lot of books published now by YouTubers, publishers like that. YouTube is a high engagement platform. It's a dedicated fan base. So if you can break into that, but if you're brand new to it, the first step is get really, really good at writing. And if you're going to do something else on the side to try to build a fan base, get really, really good at that thing. Get good at podcasting, get good at making your videos. And because the thing you're promoting has to be not just of decent quality, it's got to be striking. And I know that the joke is that everything on the internet is trash and, it's all like furry fan fiction or whatever. I'm telling you, in a market when it's absolutely flooded with content, the best way to stand out is still with quality and originality. And it's got to be so good that it's striking and that it makes people want to tell their friends to read it. Because word of mouth is the one, that's the one type of promotion that you get for free. That you're not going to have to spend money on it, and you're not going to have to devote hours of your time to, keeping a stream of content going that will engage people and build up a list of fans or a list of, fans to your newsletter or whatever platform, Substack, whatever platform people are using in the month and year that you watch this video. Likewise, Chris asks, how hard was it for you to find an agent for your first book, and did already working for Cracked help with that? That's actually not my story. See, this is one reason why my advice might not be helpful, because I had such an unusual path to where I am now. I did not have an agent. I didn't have an editor. I didn't have any connections to any publisher or publishing, any experience. I did not have an English degree. I did not have any of that stuff. I was just a guy working in an office with a blog, and then I had published John Dies at the End on the internet for free, and then sold the rights to a print-on-demand publisher, and then within a few months of that, a copy fell into the hands of a producer, Don Coscarelli, who wanted to make it into a movie, and actually got the movie made. Only then, after the movie deal was done, that a publisher came calling, because the news of the movie deal made the rounds, and they came and said, hey, this should be with a real publisher. We should do like a hardcover release for this thing. Who's your agent? I was like, I don't have one. So I asked them if they knew an agent that I could hire, and went out and found one to negotiate out this deal. But I've never submitted to a publisher or an editor. I've never written a query letter. I've never written to an agent. I did it all backwards. I got the movie deal, and then a publisher and an editor and an agent, they came to me. So any advice I have about how to break through, how to get the attention of a publisher or an editor, outside of win the lottery by having someone stumble across your book and then spend millions of dollars to make it into a movie, I don't know. Any advice I would give on that would be spurious. Aide Mio asks, can you speak to the market for writers and authors right now? Is it oversaturated? Are there any areas, genres, formats that present opportunities? I added this question even though I just said that I don't really have advice on that, because I would say please do not try to write based on what you think or what you've heard the market needs. That's a terrible creative process. And I'm not even suggesting you try to do that, but a lot of people do, because they'll say, well, when deciding what I'm going to write, well, what's hot right now? What's selling right now? But even if absolutely the thing you're wanting to write is something that absolutely does not sell, yours might be the one that does. The state of the market or the marketplace is not necessarily your situation any more than the state of the economy is necessarily your financial state. It's so, all it takes is one editor, all it takes is one publisher, all it takes is one opportunity to get your thing published. Even if they say, well, horror is not selling right now, well, yours might be the one horror that does. Conversely, lots and lots and lots of writers, I think, will say, okay, well, what's selling right now? Oh, it's young adult apocalyptic fiction, so I'm going to write one of those. Well, it's like, yeah, but you got to understand, in the time it takes you to write it and then sell it, that trend could be over because everyone else is thinking the same thing you do. I don't personally feel like it's worth it to chase trends like that. I think what will break through is something that's really, really good and really, really striking. And to write something that's really, really good and really, really striking usually comes down to hitting upon something you're so passionate about and you're so good at writing and that is so in your wheelhouse for what you're geared to do that it just bowls people over and it really hits them hard, regardless of what the market wants, regardless of what's selling at the moment. The market generally doesn't know what it wants until it comes along. Audiences usually don't know what they want until you give it to them. So you kind of have to put that stuff aside and not think of it like a businessman or a businesswoman and think more in terms of, here's the thing I feel strongly about, and here's the story idea I think I can execute and just really knock out of the park. And here's the thing. Realistically, only a tiny, tiny fraction of writers can do it full time, like sell enough that they can do what I do, where they have a full-time job where it can actually pay the bills and pay, health insurance or really, if you've got kids, like pay for diapers and food for your children. It's a tiny, tiny fraction of people who actually do that. Most writers are hobbyists. When you go to the bookstore, even the stuff you see on the shelf of the bookstore, most of those only sold a few hundred or a few thousand copies, which means the author only made a few $1,000s off of it, not enough to live off of. Writing is overwhelmingly something people do on the side. Just as sports are overwhelmingly something people do for fun versus, making a living off of it. So it is good to be realistic about that because you can have a very satisfying life writing fiction, even if it's not the day job, the thing you wake up every day and do. And in fact, a lot of writers found they were less happy doing it full time. Because they're not out living their life and then coming home and writing about what they experienced in the world of fiction. Where you may have somebody who is working as, I don't know, a cop or a social worker or whatever, and then you come home and you take your feelings and the emotions you feel in your day job and what you've seen out in the world and translate it into a story, and that's kind of like your escape or whatever. And then you find out years later, it's like, okay, you're making enough money, you can just do this full time, but now all you're doing is writing. You're not going out and experiencing the world anymore. You're not going out and meeting people. You're just sitting there writing stories all the time. And people quickly, in some cases, find out that their lives kind of stagnate, or the writing does, because it's like, well, I was writing because I was translating what I saw in my day-to-day into fiction, and now I don't have that. Now I'm just going on book tours and signing books and talking to press and writing books. And so the stuff I was writing about has dried up because I'm not doing it anymore. I'm just writing. So in terms of, the best opportunities, I would go back to what I think I said earlier in the video. The best opportunity is for you to explore your own ability to develop your own writing skills and to keep writing and keep at it until you come across the idea, the character, the genre or whatever that really fits what you can do and really fits your abilities and lets you write something so special that it kind of doesn't matter what the market is, that people will find it, people will remember it. And even if you don't get rich off of it, again, I gave away my first book for free for 6 years before I got any kind of a deal out of it and made money from it. And that was just because I wanted to just get the story out there. I just wanted it out in the world. And just the satisfaction of writing for people was enough. Final question, left this one for the end. Parrish asks, what's the best way to help support the writers you enjoy? Like, what format gets the writer the most money? If you're talking about me, don't worry about it. Get the edition that is the most convenient for you. If you prefer to read an e-reader book or whatever, I don't care. For other writers, it's purely the most expensive edition. They're getting paid a percentage or a cut. So like if you were to get one of my old books when they go on discount for $2.99 on Kindle, I'm getting a smaller cut of each one of those. But that said, if it was up to me, all of my old books would be $2.99 on Kindle, because what I would lose in per purchase, I would make back in volume, because every time they do those deep sales, the sales skyrocket. So I think I wind up making a lot more money in the long run just because you move more copies. And for me, that helps because now you've got more fans as part, who are into the franchise, and they're going to buy the next book and maybe pay more for it. But in terms of other writers out there, smaller, like more struggling writers, who are not like having fancy, cocktail parties with other giants of the genre, it's the one that costs the most. The hardcover, if they've got a hardcover, whatever, because they're making a percentage of the cover price. Okay, that's it. That's all the questions I feel like answering today. The book is out. Please buy it if you can. If you cannot, then that's also fine. Borrow a copy, I guess. But the first week sales, the pre-order sales, all of that stuff is incredibly important. That is the other thing you can do to help any writer, is buy the book early. Bookstores, in terms of the decisions the publisher makes and the stores make about what they're going to stock, what they're going to promote, comes down to the early orders, the early popularity. And the more popular it is early on, the more motivated they are to promote it, because it's like, hey, we've got a hit on our hands. So it's like this chicken or the egg thing, where the books that become hits are the ones that they choose to promote, and they choose to promote them because they're hits. So this first week is all important. Lots of you watching this video are watching it months later or years later. That's fine. It is hopefully still out there in addition to future books. I will end this video with the trailer we made, the promo trailer we made for Zoey Punches the Future, and the deck that kind of summarizes the franchise for people who didn't read the first book. You can absolutely read the second one if you've not read the first one. You're not going to be confused. It's not one continuous story. Each one is a self-contained story. Otherwise, the next John and Dave book will be out in 2022, probably around Halloween. It takes me 2 years to write a book, so you get a book every 2 years, as you could, that's just the way that time works. If you're watching this video 3 years from now, the book's probably on the shelves. And if it's not, probably should Google to see what happened to me, if I'm in jail or have died. Otherwise, thanks for being fans. Thanks for watching this video. And here is the promo for Zoey Punches the Future in the deck.
You know how sometimes you wake up naked and hungover on a friend's trampoline with only fuzzy memories of how you got there? Well, imagine all of civilization did that at once.
Friday, a local man equipped with an implanted groin enhancement lit up the dance floor, but probably not the way he intended. Aid bystanders.
That's the future. The aftermath of bad decisions everyone regrets but would definitely make again. Now imagine it's the future and you're me, living in a trailer with your cat and your mom, bothering nobody. Then one day you find out you've inherited $1 billion from a scumbag biological father you barely knew. The bad news is, you find out he made that money by committing many, many crimes. In fact, most of the things he did that weren't crimes were only legal because no one had thought to make them crimes yet. like selling black market technology that supposedly gives people superpowers.
Lookers watched in horror as a man calling himself Lord Rocket collided in midair with a flock of geese. Police say that
So now you're in charge of your father's inner circle, a team of con artists who use creepy psychological warfare tricks to secretly run everything behind the scenes. You now have no choice but to work with them, all of you trying to keep a horde of superhuman morons from tearing the city apart. Now imagine that an author wrote all of these events into an award-winning book series. Only you don't have to imagine that part, because it actually happened. The first book was called Futuristic Violence and Fancy Suits. It drew glowing praise from the New York Times, and Publishers Weekly called it subtly brilliant, which is impressive for a book that contained 36 instances of the word butt. And then imagine that for some reason no one stopped David Wong from writing a second book in the series called Zoey Punches the Future in the Dick, which is available for pre-order now pretty much anywhere books are sold. David Wong, aka Jason Pargin, is also the author of the best-selling John Dies at the End series. That one got turned into a movie. So ask your bookstore for Zoey Punches the Future in the Dick by David Wong, or go to futuristicviolence.com.